why would we not strive to raise the most competent, qualified, capable generation after generation of Christian leaders who would become, if you will, the new elites? Not in a sense of elite as in someone who's haughty or arrogant or seeks to rule over.
There's not a time zone in which he's not being praised. Listen to me, there is not a moment since the resurrection of Jesus where there's not someone somewhere declaring that Jesus saves.
Hi, welcome to God's Lawyer Podcast. I'm Pastor TJ Francis, and good Thursday morning to you for this episode of The Brief. And in this episode, I want to ask and answer this question. What is the Christian response to the erosion of Western civilization? What do we do? How do we respond? Now, some are saying, well, this is supposed to happen. We always have those who claim to have prophetic skills or credentials and are claiming that, the church loses and this is just supposed to happen. Well, I don't agree. In fact, I'm going to read to you as we kind of jump into this, a verse from the last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, chapter 11, verse 15. Now, I already recognize there are a number of different views on how to interpret the book of Revelation. And of course, everybody's view is right in their own eyes. However, this particular verse, chapter 11, verse 15, really serves almost as a thematic verse, regardless of your school of interpretation. I noticed a couple years ago, I think it was Jim Hamilton, a seminary professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who proposed the idea that the book actually could be written possibly in what is known as a chiastic structure. I'll make that very simple for you, which just means it's a Hebrew way of writing, where the main point would be in the middle. Okay, we won't get too deep into that. So let's listen to this verse. Revelation chapter 11, verse 15. I'm going to jump in just to the second half of the verse. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Now let's set your eschatological view aside for just a minute. It's not that eschatology doesn't matter. It does matter. However, I want to set aside any disagreements we might have on eschatology. By the way, eschatology means the study of end times, somebody's view of how the consummation will play out. So in this episode of The Brief, I want to talk about understanding different worldviews, different theories, but also understand as Christians, how do we respond to this? Now, this is interesting. Fidel Castro, we remember Fidel Castro as leading the communist revolution on the island of Cuba, and still a communist nation today. He said this. He said, this time, at what time? At the end of what we would consider the end of the revolution. That is when they overcame, if you will, the capitalists, the Western leaders, at least not Western leaders, those who had a Western worldview. When communists prevailed in Cuba, this is what he says. I'm going to quote here. I'm actually quoting from the European Conservative Fall 2023 issue on an article entitled The Revolutionary Worldview by Anthony Daniels. He said, this time, said Fidel Castro, at a press conference held the day after Batista fled Cuba. Batista was the former leader of the Cuban government, a pro-Western leader. Here's what Fidel Castro said. It is the real revolution. In other words, it's time for the real revolution. Now, many believe, well, the revolution's over. It's done. They've won. No. In a sense, of course, Castro was right. Daniels writes here. Cuban society really was soon to be transformed more quickly and profoundly than it had been transformed by others, so-called revolutionaries in recent Cuban history. I want you to understand what's going on here. The revolution, when people think of revolutions, they think of an armed struggle. That's not how leftists or communists or socialists think of a revolution. In fact, it's in the 60s we see this major shift from this idea that a revolution meant to take up arms. It shifts into what one author calls the Long March, where they're dedicated and focused on infiltrating institutions and agencies, academia, places of substantial influence, but not just temporal influence, but long-lasting influence. I noticed I believe it was an administrator in a local school, had a tagline under his email name. It was really kind of part of his email signature, and that is that the education of the philosophy of education taught today becomes the politics of tomorrow. Now, I'm loosely paraphrasing there, but that was what he was getting at. What is taught in the classroom today becomes the politics or the worldview of tomorrow. What you need to understand in these revolutionary movements, the idea wasn't simply to lead an armed struggle, but it was to lead an intellectual struggle. And that's where I think we need to have a response. We need to understand what's happened. In order to have a response, you have to know what's happened. Anthony Daniels goes on to write this in the article. He says, to destroy a worldview is far worse than to destroy the world. Now, these intellectuals in the socialist and communist movement understood this. That's why Castro would say that the real revolution's just begun. It was an opportunity for him and those who thought like him to transform the way people think. Now, certainly they were doing it by force and continue to do it by force in communist countries. However, we need to recognize that what's at stake, really the real battle here is a battle of ideas. And those battles really are focused around what is the ideal. That is the ideal society, the ideal person, the ideal goal, the ideal purpose and objective of humanity. Why are we here? What's our purpose? He also puts this down in his article, and I thought this was helpful because we need to recognize that these elite intellectuals, as they are recruiting young people particularly in colleges and universities, these young people think they're signing on to be part of something. However, they're just pawns. I think it's important that we start teaching our children, start teaching people that these so-called revolutionaries, these Marxist, leftist, communists, they're recruiting you, not because you're going to be part of the movement, because you're simply fodder for the movement. He writes this in his article, I came to the conclusion that peasants were the cannon fodder of the intellectuals and university students, aggravated that a university education, now much more widespread and therefore more diluted than formerly, no longer translated automatically into membership of a small socio-political and economic elite. In other words, they sold them a lie. They're recruiting all these college students, these idealists, okay, that if you pursue this philosophical worldview, and if you receive these credentials and education and you buy in, you quote-unquote drink the Kool-Aid, you will be accepted into this small group of elites. What they didn't realize is that they were just pawns. And that's the same today as we think about what's happening. In a recent issue of the Epoch Times, January 31st through February 6, 2024, Michael Booner writes this article entitled, How Can We Halt the Erosion of Western Civilizations at the Hands of the Elite? Now, that title grabbed my attention. I've been saying for some time, we need to raise up the next generation of leaders. Christians need to focus on raising up the next generation of leaders. That's our calling. You say, well, we're called to make disciples. Well, what are disciples? Disciples are followers of Jesus. They are learners. He said to teach them to do all that I've commanded you. He told us to go out, go ye therefore make disciples. The very fact you're making a disciple implies that you're taking a leadership role. And if we're to make disciples of all nations, certainly we're to raise our children up to be leaders. Unfortunately, for far too long, the mantra has really almost been this, if we want to just be blunt about it. We have believed, that our responsibility was essentially to raise successive generations of Christians to adopt a loser mentality instead of a leader mentality. So I saw this article entitled, How Can We Halt the Erosion of Western Civilization at the Hands of the Elites? And frankly, the article really essentially saying this, we can't quit. We need a plan. We need a strategy, a long-term strategy. And I like what he says here. This is very helpful. Helps us think through this matter because I've been saying it for a while. We need to play the long game. He says we need a new elite. Now, when you think of elite, of course, for many of us, especially amongst the middle class or working class, it has a lot of negative connotations. Like, why would we want our children to become elitist? Not elitist in their thinking, but it almost carries with this idea of an aristocracy. Now, you say, this is a democracy. Okay, first of all, we live in a republic. The United States of America is a republic, where it means where we elect people to represent us in a republican form of government. It's not a true democracy. And you say, well, we're against an aristocracy. Well, every society has an aristocracy. Even if you go back and you look at Athens, it was a democracy. There certainly was a ruling class. Every society has a ruling class. Within communist societies, a very small ruling class. You say, well, in the United States of America, even in a republic, there's not an aristocracy. There is, and there always has been. And to deny that is to ignore the obvious and to be governed. So you're going to be governed. People will be governed by an aristocracy. Now, you can call it any other name. You can call it elites, you can call it academic elites, political ruling class, academic elites, all across the board, technocrats. Here's the question. Are we willing to raise successive generations to become the new aristocracy? I mean, you think about even some of these great theories of government. The great thinkers in the past of antiquity understood that there are going to be talented, capable, qualified people who are going to rise to the top and lead. As our generation looks at what's going on, we can take a mentality to say, well, we're just throwing in a town, we give up. Well, what's that leave for our children and grandchildren? That's not an appropriate response to the erosion of Western civilization. Now, there's some say, well, we hate Western civilization. We hate everything about it. Well, I don't. I believe Western civilization and its ideas are inherently Christian. Certainly there's some things that are wrong and should be criticized, but we should be focused on raising up successive generations. Now, I want to go back to this idea that we need a new elite. I like the article and I like how he's thinking. I want to quote him here. And I want to take a step back and talk about what we mean by a new elite. He says, what we need, ideally, is a new elite, one that cultivates respect instead of contempt for the values of ordinary people, one that seeks stability and order instead of chaos. This may be a tall order, and it may not be possible in the short term. I can't help but to be excited when I hear someone else talking about playing the long game. Elite interests may be too deeply entrenched, though they should be warned that they will suffer the most in the event of the collapse because they have the farthest to fall. And yet, I see a few, if any, signs that change is coming. Certainly he's leveraging here. However, he goes on to say this, and this is important. Nevertheless, despite the perception of gathering gloom, we should remember that civilization has overcome stagnation and collapse many times before, even after long intervals of disorder. We should be confident that recovery is always possible. He makes a reference to a few groups. One that kind of jumps out is the Benedictine monks who preserved and copied classical text after the fall of Rome. I thought that's very helpful, especially when we think about the book, The Benedict Option, something I want to address in a future episode of the brief. So as you think about this, the plan that's been executed, this didn't happen overnight. This communist Marxist ideology that is swarming over our culture, that's dominating amongst the elites. It's the prevailing worldview amongst the elites and the aristocracy in our culture. Why would we not strive to raise the most competent, qualified, capable generation after generation of Christian leaders who would become, if you will, the new elites? Not in a sense of elite as in someone who's haughty or arrogant or seeks to rule over. See, that's the difference. The current elites, and this is part of the if you will, the deterioration of Western culture, is these elites, this ruling class, they want to lord over. Okay, inherently in a Marxist ideology is that they know best. A small group of people know what's best for others. And I want to show you the difference. There's a difference between thinking you know what's best and striving to do what's best. You say that's just a nuance. It's more than a nuance. On the first one, there's this arrogance And there's also this idea that the masses are ignorant. On the other hand, there's this idea of empowering the masses to receive information and education, and then they're able then to take that information and then demand of their representatives that they carry out the will of the people. Certainly in a Christian society, the will of the people, that is, the people who are submitting themselves to God, submitting themselves to the Lord Jesus Christ, will want to carry out the will of God according to the law of God as recorded in His Word. So when we think about this long-term plan, I want you to know that this doesn't happen overnight. I mean, you can go back to the 60s and you can see this long march. In this article I found here in the New Criterion, October 2023, was very helpful in understanding this. This article is written by James Pearson. The New Conservative Dilemma is what he says here. He points out that he references an author by the name of Christopher Rufo, and he believes that he provides an answer. Now, some would say that Rufo is extreme, but of course, just remember, whoever is calling you extreme, look at that person. Usually it's an extremist calling someone else an extremist. So you're just going to throw that out there. Don't be afraid because a Marxist calls somebody extreme. As soon as a Marxist calls someone extreme, I'm probably going to want to read them and find out what's going on because you should wear it as a badge of honor. If a Marxist is calling you an extremist, wear it as a badge of honor. But he has an eye-opening book, he says, called America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. And Rufo is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So, and of course, James Pearson says that he is a fellow there also. He points out, though, that there were a couple intellectual thinkers who persuaded the new left to step away from this idea of an overthrow, a radical overthrow, a taking up arms. You see, some of this was witnessed in the 1960s with some of these groups, the Weather Underground and some others, some of these radical, violent groups. They shifted. And there was a major shift. This shift, they were persuaded to, in the 1960s, to abandon dreams of a violent revolution and instead move into schools, colleges, and government with a long-run plan to subvert the capitalist system from within. I said recently that we need to train our young people to go in and be subversive. And someone had pushed back on that and said, well, that's not Christian. Okay, think about this. Let's just pause for just a moment. What's the Christian response to the erosion of Western civilization? Is it to be passive? Now, I didn't say we send them in to be liars or dishonest, but to subvert. I mean, subvert carries with it the idea of something is going in one direction and you seek to prevent it. So truly the idea of sending in Christian leaders, training up successive generations who are competent and qualified, it would be to subvert the elites who seek to rule over and dominate a free society. That's worth subverting. And they don't have to be immoral or dishonest or unethical to do so. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to train up the most ethical, capable, moral, responsible leaders who operate with integrity and discipline, who live by faith, who are focused on their mission. If we're willing to do that and play the long-term game, think about this was in the 60s. We're talking about, you fast forward to today. This was just about 65 years ago that there was this shift. That's a generation and a half. Massive change. You say, well, it could never be undone. We certainly could do it in that amount of time, maybe sooner. Some, I believe, are right when they say this, that secularism is dying. It's on the decline. We're seeing, statistics are showing us that probably the most conservative generation that we've seen in several generations is the one coming out of high school right now, particularly amongst males. We're seeing the numbers of those who identify as conservative or right-leaning increasing rapidly. Now, you might say, well, as a Christian, does it matter left or right? That's not necessarily a Christian way of thinking, but certainly if you're on the conservative or right side and you are against the taking of innocent life, particularly taking the innocent life in the womb, these certain things, of course, there's going to be a number of things that we're going to want to line up there. It doesn't mean it's a full-scale endorsement, but we're recognizing that there's a pendulum shift here. So why not play the long game? Why not send our young people in kind of a, if you will, a new long march? It's a long march. It's difficult. It's going to take time. I believe part of the problem is, I want to say this to Christians, I love you and I appreciate you, but many of you are lazy. You're lazy. If you can't have it right now, you can't have a quick fix solution, you're not willing to do it. And if you look at it, we're being outworked. Christians are being outworked by and large. And there's a number of Christians and Christian organizations and institutions that are fighting the good fight of the faith, and I'm grateful for that. And we need to plug in with them. But I'm telling you that many, many of you have just become lazy and apathetic. Many even claiming that it's supposed to happen this way, as if somehow your laziness or apathy is serving some sort of prophetic purpose. That's absurd. Here's what we need to recognize, is that over those 60 years, people committed to a leftist, Marxist, communist worldview have sought to destroy the Western worldview, which is inherently a Christian worldview, by training successive generations and putting them into government jobs, teaching jobs. I mean, if you look at, there's some recent data that came out about doctoral level students, the percentage of them that are leftists or left-leaning, entire departments at universities where you can't even find a registered Republican. Again, being a Republican is inherently Christian, and being a Christian doesn't mean you're a Republican. I'm just using this to illustrate, for example, how these institutions have almost been completely taken over. And you say, well, we can give up. No, what we can do is we can outwork them. We can work harder, training up successive generations to be the most capable and competent leaders out there, period. I want to point out really just kind of one last article. I'm hoping just to get you thinking about this, get you excited and fired up. You say, where's this responsibility start? It starts in your home. It starts in your home. You are the primary educator of your children. I don't care if you say, well, I don't homeschool my children. Well, if you're homeschooling your children, great. Not everyone is homeschooling their children. In my home, we've not traditionally homeschooled our children. Now, that doesn't mean we're not educating our children in our home. Don't misunderstand that. This isn't an either or. It's a both and for us. And we've made a decision that we believe is appropriate for our family. And whatever decision you've made, it does not mean that you are not responsible for the education of your children. You, as parents, are the primary educators of your children. Education is the passing on of a way of life from one generation to the next. The Marxists are passing on a way of life that is inherently anti-Christian and anti-Western. They're unapologetic about it. I'm not telling you something that's hidden or secret or that they're embarrassed about. They're actually proud of that. And as a response, it needs to start in our home that we are educating our children, that we are teaching them the truth of God's Word, the truth about deadly and dangerous worldviews such as communism, socialism, and Marxism. Really kind of just, they're different flavors, but they're really kind of all from the same source. A lot of people are talking about localism. That's where we got to start, localism. If that's true, which I believe it is, the answer is local, 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 local. There's nothing more local than your home. It must start in your home. And that means that my generation is not going to be the generation that is going to see this significant change. But my generation, Generation X, we can work tirelessly to support and pour in to millennials, to Gen Z, and now Gen Alpha, the new generation label for those born the year 2010 and later. My two of my youngest children are in Generation Alpha, and thinking about how I'm pouring into them so that they can be part of this long march. And as I'm pouring into them, I'm already thinking about my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, how I can pour into my kids in such a way that they can be disciple-making disciples, raising up successive generations. We've got to think local. Another reason I think that we are not being effective, generally speaking, as Christians, of pushing back against the erosion of Western civilization is we get hyper-focused on all things federal. Most of that is truly outside of your control. Now, that does not release you from the responsibility as a Christian to be active in voting and in encouraging other Christians to be registered and vote. Absolutely, we should do that. However, What's missed is the opportunity to influence our local communities. We've got to think local. The political strategies that we must put in place, the cultural revolution for us, is not one of violent overthrow. That is not the case. It's one of intellectual victory. And that intellectual victory has to be local. And what I mean by local, start in your home and then the sphere of influence. People who are going to be willing to listen to you, hear you out. Your neighbors who know you. If you're running a business, people who trust you. This is what we mean by local. Stay focused on the local sphere. If every Christian church, regardless of your denomination, here for us as Southern Baptists, partnering with other Southern Baptist churches, now that doesn't mean that we wouldn't partner with other churches and some initiatives that would seek to transform our community. We definitely want to be part of it. There are a number of organizations here locally that are trying to bring pastors and churches together to see holistic transformation in this community. It means that if we focus, if First Baptist Church of Dover will focus on the Dover, Plant City, Seffner, Valrico area, if we focus on this area, now we're not the only church. If other churches also are focused on this area, imagine what would happen around the United States if every Christian, every church, every family was focused local, local, local. What would happen? We would see national change. That's the key. So you say, what am I taking away from this episode of The Brief? Here's what you're taking away from it. Your children, the education of your children and your grandchildren. You might say, well, those are my grandchildren. That's my kids' responsibility. Listen, they're your progeny. Those are descendants, your descendants. You have a responsibility to them. Pour into your adult children so that they have the resources. Invest in them so that they have the ability to make sure that their children are receiving the best possible education, whether that's in your home or whether that's in a Christian school or whether it's in a public school. Some of you have said, we're just throwing the public school out altogether. We're not. We're actually, we want to support Christians who are there working tirelessly. And I'm going to tell you right now, we're even going to support, there are a number of people who don't identify as Christian, but also agree with our values and principles. Well, we want to support them. Why? Because they're pouring into this community. We want to support our administrators, period. This isn't an either or. It is an all of the above approach. You must take responsibility for the education of your children and grandchildren. We must focus local. Let's get involved in local politics. Let's get involved in things locally. Let's be engaged here locally. And that transformation, it's going to continue to spread. So in future episodes of The Brief, I want to talk more about this as we deal with this erosion of Western civilization. I just want to kind of jump out with that to get you thinking today. But when you hit stop and you end this episode, I want you to recognize you have a responsibility this afternoon, this evening, to sit down with your family, with your children, and talk about your values, your principles. Because Western civilization, it would just be an abstract idea, but it's based on Christian values, things that are important. Why don't you do this tonight? Sit down and write down what are your family's values and virtues. Teach them to your children, that they might teach them to their children, and we would hold on to this great heritage that we received and pass on a legacy of loving the Lord Jesus Christ and serving Him as our great King. Well, until the nations are converted, and frankly, that starts here local, starting here in this community. Until this community is converted, there can be no excuses, no surrender, and no retreat. Why? Because Jesus is King. He's not just my King. He's the King of Kings, which means He's the King of Dover, Florida, and He's the King of First Baptist Church. Until then, no excuses, no retreat, and no